Welcome, dear friends, and let me tell you a story of newfound love, of a family torn apart by misunderstanding and pride, but given a second chance at unity. Enjoy the story. Sarah Wilson dabbed at her reddened eyes with a crumpled tissue, struggling to stifle her sobs. The strong, single mother who ran her own successful bakery and had raised her son John to be a model student was, on this particular evening, unable to speak a coherent word. It had started out as a perfectly ordinary day. Sarah had woken up at 6:30 a.m., half an hour before her son's alarm went off, as was her custom. She padded into the kitchen and cracked a couple of eggs into a sizzling pan, the familiar aromas of butter and breakfast filling the cozy apartment. The tea kettle began to whistle, just as she slid the fluffy omelet onto a plate. Exactly at 7 a.m., the sound of John's footsteps signaled his arrival in the kitchen, punctual as always thanks to his mother's strict upbringing. "Morning, Mom," he greeted, planting a quick peck on her cheek before taking his seat at the small kitchen table. "Good morning, honey," Sarah replied with a warm smile, setting his plate down. "Tea or orange juice today?" "Tea, please," John answered, already digging into his breakfast. As they ate, mother and son discussed the previous day's events and made plans for the evening ahead, a cherished morning ritual that Sarah treasured. With John's evenings often packed with school activities and part-time jobs, these brunches were sometimes the only quality time they had together. "I'm going to the movies tonight," John mentioned between bites. "With Amy." Sarah's smile tightened slightly at the mention of the girl's name. Amy Caldwell had always struck her as a tad too immodest and provocative in her manner of dressing for Sarah's tastes, with her tight low-cut tops and micro miniskirts. But she knew better than to interfere too much in her teenage son's choices of romantic partners. "That's nice, dear," was all she said. "Need any money?" John shook his head. "Nah, I've got enough saved up for my allowance." "What movie are you seeing?" Sarah asked, silently hoping it would be something age-appropriate. John simply shrugged. "I'm not sure. Amy just said she'd pick something." Sarah suppressed a knowing grin, remembering her own youth, when she and John's father Michael would use the movies as a front, spending most of the time making out shamelessly in the back row of the theater. The rest of the day proceeded uneventfully, with Sarah baking cupcakes and cookies for the shop's evening rush while John was at school. It wasn't until 10 p.m. that her world came crashing down with a frantic call from Amy. "Mrs. Wilson!" the girl's shrill voice crackled through the phone. "Oh my God! You have to come quick! We were attacked, and John's been hurt really bad." Sarah's heart seized in her chest. "Attacked? Where are you? What happened?" "We're at Mercy Hospital. Please hurry," Amy cried, before abruptly hanging up. Sarah was out the door and in her car in seconds, peeling out of the driveway with squealing tires. Her normally tame driving suddenly became reckless, ignoring stop signs and red lights, drawing blaring honks and obscene gestures from other drivers. All she could think about was reaching her son. She burst through the hospital's emergency entrance, her disheveled appearance and frantic demeanor immediately drawing the attention of a nurse. "My son was attacked. Where is he? John Wilson." The nurse quickly ushered Sarah to a private waiting room where a distraught Amy sat, tears streaming down her face. "Amy, what happened? Where's John?" Sarah demanded, her own eyes brimming. The girl looked up with red-rimmed eyes. We were just leaving the theater after the movie," she stammered between sobs. "These 3 guys approached us looking for trouble. One of them, he had a knife. He just stabbed John over and over. Oh God, there was so much blood." Sarah felt her knees buckle as Amy's words hit her like a sledgehammer to the gut. She collapsed into the nearest chair, her face drained of all color. A doctor entered the room, his solemn expression confirming Sarah's worst fears. She looked up at him with desperate, pleading eyes. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm afraid your son's injuries are extremely severe," the doctor began gravely. "The knife penetrated several vital organs and damaged his spinal cord. We've done everything we can, but—" He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. "I need you to prepare for the worst." "No," Sarah whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. Hot tears spilled down her cheeks as her body was racked with sobs. "No, please God, no. Not my baby boy." She clutched at the doctor's white coat, her knuckles white. "Please, Doc, you have to save him. Name your price. I'll pay anything. I'll sell everything I own, just please don't let my son die." The doctor gently pried her hands off and pulled her into an embrace, his own eyes glistening with sympathy. "Mrs. Wilson, money isn't the issue here. It's about how his body responds to the trauma, massive internal injuries like these." He didn't finish the thought. "Can I see him? Please, I need to say goodbye," Sarah begged, her voice choked with anguish. Nodding solemnly, the doctor led the distraught mother to the intensive care unit where John lay unconscious, tubes and wires snaking out of his frail body. The incessant beeping of the machines monitoring his faltering vitals was the only sound in the cold, sterile room. Sarah collapsed into the chair beside his bed, taking his limp hand in hers as she stroked his pale cheek. "My beautiful boy," she whispered brokenly. "Mommy's here, honey. I'm so sorry." After an eternity of gasping sobs and whispered endearments, Sarah finally tore herself away, planting one last kiss on her son's clammy forehead. She hugged Amy tightly on her way out, both of them too overcome to speak. It was outside the hospital entrance where Sarah's life took an unexpected turn. A wizened old woman in tattered rags abruptly stepped into her path, studying her with clouded eyes. "You must find the boy's father," the gypsy woman proclaimed in a thick Romani accent. "Bring him here. His presence may be the spark needed to rekindle the flame of life." Sarah could only gape at her in confusion and growing annoyance at the bizarre interruption. "What? Who are you? I don't have time for this nonsense." But the old woman was insistent, gnarled hands gripping Sarah's arm with surprising strength. "The path ahead will be arduous, but you must complete this journey. The boy's life may depend on it." Wrenching free, Sarah stormed off to her car, dismissing the ramblings as those of a drunken vagrant. But as she drove away, the gypsy's words echoed hauntingly in her mind. She knew where John's father was. They had split up over 15 years ago after a bitter fight, but she still had his last known address from when he moved to Tallahassee. It was nearly a 350-mile drive, but Sarah suddenly found herself pulling off the highway and programming the address into her GPS. 8 hours later, she finally arrived in the quiet Florida neighborhood, pulling up to the modest single-story home, bathed in the crimson glow of the setting sun. Taking a steadying breath, Sarah steeled herself and marched up to the front door, giving it a firm series of raps. The door swung open to reveal a man in his late 30s, his bemused expression morphing into one of shock and confusion. "Sarah? Sarah Wilson? What the hell are you doing here?" Despite her anguish, a part of Sarah couldn't help drinking in the sight of her ex-lover, Michael Harris, still as ruggedly handsome as the day they had first met. His dark hair was now peppered with hints of silver, and crinkles had appeared at the corners of his eyes, but his piercing green eyes were exactly as she remembered. "Michael, I need your help," she managed, fighting to keep her voice from breaking as tears welled up again. "It's John, our son. Oh God." The dam broke as harsh sobs racked her body, and she found herself collapsing against his chest, clutching desperately at him. Michael's arms instinctively went around Sarah, holding her trembling form against him as she poured out her anguish. He guided her inside, settling them both on the couch as she struggled to regain her composure enough to explain. "John was attacked," she finally choked out between ragged breaths. "Stabbed multiple times. The doctors, they're not sure if he'll make it." Michael's handsome face drained of all color as the words hit him like a sucker punch to the gut. "Oh my God. No, please, no." Seeing the anguish and fear mirrored in his eyes, the very eyes that John had inherited, Sarah felt her own parental torment compounded tenfold. She had deprived Michael of watching their son grow up over a stupid misunderstanding and stubborn pride. "Michael, I'm so sorry," she whispered brokenly. "I never should have kept him from you. You had a right to be there, to be his father." He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair as she recounted the events of that fateful night 15 years ago when their worlds had fallen apart. How he had left for a few weeks to care for his ailing grandmother, promising to return as soon as he could. But then he had witnessed a woman being harassed and stepped in to help, only to end up in the hospital himself after the thug's buddies joined in. By the time he recovered and returned, Sarah had already cut off all contact, stubbornly refusing to hear his explanations about the delay. "I tried to find you, to tell you about John, but you had changed your number and moved," Michael said hoarsely. "God, Sarah, if I had known, if I had any idea you were pregnant with my child—" I know, Sarah replied, her tears leaving dark splotches on his shirt. "I was just so hurt and angry, I couldn't think straight. And I punished us both by depriving John of having his father in his life. Can you ever forgive me?" Michael tilted her chin up, his thumb brushing away the glistening streaks on her cheeks as he stared into her eyes, the same deep blue oceans he had gotten lost in all those years ago. "We were both young and stupid," he said gruffly. "All that matters now is being there for our son. Whatever happens, however much time he has left, I need to see him, Sarah, to let him know I'm here for him." Sarah nodded, a wavering smile tugging at her lips, as she studied the face of the man she had never truly stopped loving, despite the years and resentments that had kept them apart. In that moment, she made a silent vow that when John recovered, she would do everything in her power to preserve this second chance she had been granted. The drive back to Mercy Hospital passed in a heavy silence, both Michael and Sarah lost in their own swirling emotions and turbulent thoughts about their fractured family. As soon as they arrived, Sarah led Michael straight to the ICU, her heart clenching at the sight of their son's fragile form, amid the tangle of tubes and wires monitoring his faltering vital signs. "Oh, Johnny." Michael's gruff voice caught in his throat as he reached out with a trembling hand to caress his son's ashen cheek. Tears streamed unabashed down his face, all his pent-up dreams of fatherhood crashing down around him. Sarah slipped an arm around his waist, leaning her head against his shoulder as they stood vigil over their child's sickbed. After an eternity, Michael turned to the doctor, who had been silently observing the emotional reunion. "Doc, can I have a few minutes alone with him, please?" His eyes implored the physician, who gave a solemn nod of assent before gesturing for Sarah to join him outside. As the door closed behind them, Michael pulled a chair up close and grasped John's limp hand in both of his calloused ones. "Hey, champ, it's your dad," he began in a hushed tone. "Yeah, I know. I've got a lot of making up to do after being absent all these years. No excuses, I messed up real bad, son." He paused, swallowing hard as he struggled to find the right words after so many lost years. "But that's gonna change. You hear me, Johnny?" Michael leaned in closer, his voice thick with emotion. "If you fight through this, if you keep battling like the strong young man your mom raised you to be, I'll be right here. We'll have all the time in the world to get to know each other, to become the real father and son we should have been from the start." He brushed a stray lock of hair from John's pale forehead, his eyes drinking in every detail of his son's face, mentally etching it into his memory. "You gotta pull through this, kid. Your mom, she's been through enough, raising you all on her own while I was off being a selfish jackass. She needs you, and God help me, I need you too, son. More than I could ever put into words." Michael's shoulders began to shake with suppressed sobs as he poured out over 15 years of paternal hopes, dreams, and regrets in a hushed torrent to his unconscious child. "I'll be the dad you deserved from day one. We'll do all the father-son stuff, throw a baseball, go camping. I'll even sit through your dumb school plays if you want." A watery chuckle escaped his lips. "Whatever it takes to make up for the lost time, just don't leave me now that I finally found you both. Please, Johnny, please fight. I love you, son." He finally fell silent, slumping in the hard plastic chair, one hand still gripping John's while the other shielded his eyes as he wept unabashedly. It was how Sarah found him nearly an hour later when she peeked in, her own eyes shimmering with renewed hope at the tender, raw scene between father and son. Outside in the stark waiting room, Sarah found Amy still keeping her lonely vigil, red-rimmed eyes downcast. The poor girl looked up with a heartbreakingly hopeful expression as Sarah approached. "Mrs. Wilson, any change?" she asked hesitantly. Sarah shook her head, feeling a pang of sympathy and guilt for the trauma this girl had endured by association with her family's turmoil. She gathered Amy up in a motherly embrace, stroking her disheveled blonde curls in a comforting gesture. "Not yet, honey. But we just have to stay strong and keep praying for a miracle," Sarah murmured. "This isn't your fault at all. John's a tough kid. He'll pull through this." Amy simply nodded against Sarah's shoulder, fresh tears seeping out as she clung to the older woman's strength and reassurance. They stayed like that for several long moments, until a commotion from the ICU waiting area drew their attention. "That's the doctor!" Sarah exclaimed, pulling away and hurrying out with Amy on her heels. The physician was indeed striding towards them, his expression unreadable beneath the surgical mask. Sarah felt her heart clench with fear, until the man's eyes crinkled into an unmistakable smile above the mask. "Mrs. Wilson, you'd better prepare yourself," he said, pulling down the face covering to reveal a broad grin. "Because it looks like we may be witnessing a genuine miracle here." Sarah's knees nearly buckled with relief, and Amy let out a joyous whoop as the doctor continued. "Over the past few hours, John's vitals have shown remarkable signs of stabilizing. His brain activity has increased, and his body seems to be rallying instead of shutting down as we feared. I honestly can't explain it, but somehow he's pulling through this against all odds." "Oh, thank you, Lord," Sarah breathed, clutching Amy's hands as they both dissolved into giddy, tear-streaked laughter of delirious joy. "Can we see him?" Sarah asked eagerly, already heading for the ICU entrance with Michael joining them, having witnessed the entire joyous scene. The doctor nodded, his own face beaming with barely restrained elation. "Of course, but try not to overexcite him. He's still critically ill, but this is, well, it's nothing short of a miracle." Michael slipped an arm around Sarah's waist as they followed the doctor, both rendered speechless by the stunning turn of events. All those years of bitterness and regret had led them to this precipice, this second chance they had been granted to rebuild their family. As they reached John's bedside, Sarah leaned her head against Michael's sturdy chest, profoundly grateful for the wise words of that strange gypsy woman. Over the next few days, John's condition continued to improve at a remarkable rate that left the medical staff shaking their heads in amazement. Michael and Sarah were a constant presence at his bedside, holding vigils and murmuring quiet words of love and encouragement. Finally, one crisp autumn morning nearly a week later, John's eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused at first, before settling on the two figures leaning over him with matching expressions of tearful relief. "Mom," he croaked out, his voice little more than a dry rasp. "What happened?" "Shh, it's okay, honey," Sarah soothed, gently stroking his brow as she blinked back grateful tears. "You're in the hospital, but you're going to be just fine. You gave us all quite a scare there for a while." John's brow furrowed in confusion as his eyes landed on the second figure, a vaguely familiar man with kind green eyes that matched his own. "Who?" Michael stepped forward, clearing his throat nervously as he took his son's hand. "Hey, champ. I'm your dad, Michael Harris." John's eyes widened in shock and bewilderment as decades of questions were suddenly answered. Sarah squeezed Michael's arm in a silent show of support. "I know I haven't been around, and there's no excuse for that," Michael continued gruffly. "But I'm here now, son, and I'm not going anywhere if you'll have me." He searched John's face apprehensively, fearing rejection after so many years of abandonment. But slowly, wonderingly, John's features melted into a warm smile as he gave his father's hand a weak squeeze. I'd like that, Dad," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. In that moment, Michael felt like the luckiest man in the world. Over the next couple of weeks, father and son began to tentatively bond and rebuild the connection that had been denied them for so long. Michael regaled John with stories from his own troubled youth, as well as hilarious anecdotes about Sarah that had the boy laughing despite his pain. For her part, Sarah simply drank in the sight of her two men getting to know each other, her heart swelling with joy. The turning point came one sunny afternoon, when Amy stopped by for a visit, her usual bubbly demeanor subdued with lingering guilt over the attack. Michael and Sarah tactfully excused themselves, allowing the young couple some privacy. In the hallway, Michael took Sarah's hands in his, staring deeply into the eyes that had haunted his dreams for over 15 years. "You know, We've been given a second chance here, he murmured gruffly. Most people don't get an opportunity like this to hit the reset button on their biggest mistake. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat as she registered the intensity of his gaze, the undeniable spark that still crackled between them after so much time and turmoil. Are you saying you want to give us another try? She asked hesitantly, desperately trying to guard her heart, even as it fluttered with long-suppressed hope. Michael reached up to tuck an errant strand of hair behind her ear, his calloused fingertips ghosting along the line of her jaw as he leaned in closer. I'm saying I never stopped loving you, Sarah Wilson, he rumbled. Not for a single day in the past 15 years. And I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you and John if you'll let me. He moved in for a long-awaited kiss, but Sarah placed a hand on his chest, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears of joy, even as she shook her head ruefully. After all this time, all the mistakes and heartache we've caused each other, you'd think I'd know better than to let you sweet-talk me so easily, she chided with a watery smile. But I'm too old and too wise now to keep impeding other people's happiness, especially my own. This time it was Sarah who initiated the searing kiss, pulling Michael flush against her as she melted into his embrace, effortlessly rekindling the smoldering embers of desire that had never fully died between them, despite everything.